session for the year with the Western Fire, Forest, and Resilience Collaborative, led by Winslow Hansen. My name is Claire Sturm, and I'm with the Wildfire Science and Technology Commons. We're excited to have this opportunity to collaborate and be a part of the Wildfire Resilience Future together as this growing initiative and community. As the Commons is moving forward through this collaboration community of practice, we're looking to bring forward more opportunities like highlighting the work that Winslow and his team are producing here today, and also identifying other pathfinders that are in the wildfire and fire tech space that we can talk and explore together as a community. And with that, I think our waiting room is starting to slow down a little bit, but maybe we can go ahead and hand it over to Winslow.
Great, thanks so much. Really appreciate the invitation from Claire and Ilke, and fun to see names I recognize on the call and new collaborators and colleagues as well. So really appreciate the opportunity. Hey, Jenny, nice to see you. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the work we've been doing over the last few years in the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. This is a multi-institution, multi-year research program funded in large part by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation as part of their Wildfire Resilience Initiative. I'm the director of the collaborative, but just the spokesperson for a really large number of folks and research that I'll be touching on today. And my formal job is an assistant scientist at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. So let's get into it. There we go. So, we study forests and fires in the Western United States, and I feel like it's really important to start every talk by reminding each audience that Western forests have burned for millennia, right? Thousands of years. So here we're looking at drone footage of a huge fire that burned west of the Cascade Crest, just north of Seattle a few years ago. And if you looked back at that landscape scale, you could see it was just ginormous. And now we're looking at a close-up. The mature trees are killed. It kind of looks like a moonscape. Somebody might be confused and say, this is a destroyed forest. But in reality, if you put your nose to the ground here, which we actually did as very nerdy forest ecologists, you'd notice that it's just littered with tree seedlings of the same species that was there before the fire. They're almost certainly going to establish and grow up, and this will be eventually a forest that's very structurally and functionally similar to what was there before the fire. In fact, many of these tree species are evolutionarily adapted to fire, right? They need fire. But we also know, sorry, just working through the slides here. Here we go. We also know that with climate change, we're seeing huge increases in burned area of forests of the Western United States over the last few decades. So this is an analysis, a time series that my colleague Park Williams put together that looks from 1984 to today, how much area has burned in Western US forests each year. 84 is kind of the beginning of satellites coming online, so that's our starting point. And we've documented just over 1,000% increase in annual burned area. This is because forests are fires are tremendously sensitive to climate. So now we're looking at the exact same years in the annual area burned on the y-axis, but instead of time on the x-axis, we have vapor pressure deficit, which is a representation of fuel moisture or fuel dryness. And you can see that this is a very, very tight relationship. Note our acres burned are actually on a log scale here. Another really important point to take away from this is that because the earlier period is colored blue and the later period is colored red, you can see this very distinct shift from cooler, wetter seasons with less fire to hotter, drier seasons with a lot more fire. And we know from global circulation models that vapor pressure deficit and its drying effects on fuels are only going to increase into the future. So now we're looking at vapor pressure deficit on the Y for fire seasons across Western US forests. And we're looking at time series from 1900 all the way out to 2100. Where black is the observed vapor pressure deficit, And then the blue and red represent the median of general circulation models forced with a middle of the roads emission scenario and a high-end emission scenario. So we can expect a lot more drier conditions into the future and likely a lot more fire because of that. But we also know that while climate change is the 60,000-pound gorilla in the room, it's not the only factor that matter. You have to have fuels to have fire too. And imagine a hypothetical world where we have the same climate conditions in the Mojave Desert at a given point in the forests of the Sierra. Which one do you think is likely to carry more fire? Obviously the Sierras, right? Because there's actually fuels there to burn. You have to have those fuels. We also know that there's tremendous variability even within ecosystems like these forests in the Sierra in terms of fuel availability, both over time and across space. And as a society, we've done a tremendous job in large areas of forests of the Western United States in suppressing fire for roughly 150 years, both directly by putting fires out and through the extirpation of cultural burning. So this is a time series of images just meant to highlight that. So we're looking at Yosemite Valley in 1899 versus closer to today. And just by looking at it, you can see how much more biomass is in this forested ecosystem and how much more connected those fuels are. So together, the abrupt climate change and this legacy of past suppression leading to a buildup of fuels is really challenging us both from a social and ecological perspective and how to live sustainably with fire and how to make sure our ecosystems remain resilient. I could have put up, any number of examples here. I feel like they just grow and grow every year, of course. So a couple random ones here to highlight the challenge. We had the 2020 Labor Day fires in Washington and Oregon that consumed thousands of structures and led to a huge class action lawsuit against the utility company that ignited the fire. The infamous Camp Fire in California in 2018 that consumed the entire town of Paradise and produced huge amounts of smoke that choked out the Bay Area for a long time. In Colorado, the Grizzly Creek Fire, where after the burn, there was big landslides that actually closed I-70 for 2 weeks. And then in northern New Mexico, the Las Conchas Fire in 2011 that converted tens of thousands of acres of ponderosa pine forest permanently to shrubland and grassland. And of course, managers are tasked with dealing with this time of profound uncertainty and trying to figure out how to steward ecosystems and people through this time. And while we've made a tremendous amount of progress, there's still a lot of scientific uncertainty that remains. Just one example here. So, we know prescribed burning and mechanical thinning works really well at the stand level. So if a fire hits a recent treatment, we know it has strong effects on fire behavior. But it's a really profound challenge to think about how to scale that up, right? So if you think about the forests and other ecosystem types across the West, even dry forests alone, where that mechanical thinning and prescribed burning works really well, covers a huge amount of area. And much of it is really hard to access. There's also a lot of different vegetation types out there where prescribed burning and mechanical thinning may not be as effective. And so how do we tailor strategies to these local ecosystems and then scale it up? So how do we scale solutions? What about those other vegetation types? And that's where WFFRC is really hoping to make an impact. So the goal of WFFRC is to address this overarching question of how can we accelerate advancements in forest ecology and fire science to ensure decision makers are well supported, that we're addressing their needs and that we're reducing that scientific uncertainty. And we're trying to accomplish this through two specific goals. So the first is doing convergent and actionable research very rapidly in partnership with the decision makers that we think are most likely to use and benefit from this information. And then second, our goal is to help catalyze innovation across the broader fire science community through open science best practices, through convening, so that we serve as a nucleus of innovation that extends well beyond our core researchers. Now, when we started planning this effort a few years ago, it became really clear that if we're going to produce science that decision makers are actually going to use, we better talk to decision makers about what kind of science they need. And so that first year, we just picked up the phone and tried to talk with anybody that would answer an email or a phone call. We ended up doing interviews with 19 decision makers that spanned from federal and state government to nonprofits to boundary organizations. And then we had a town hall at UCLA where we brought together 40 scientists and decision makers to really interrogate some of the initial information we got from those first interviews. And finally, we conducted 4 regional focus group meetings with folks in the Southwest, and Colorado, the Northern Rockies, and the Pacific Northwest to explore alignment with local needs. And that brought out some really interesting research needs that we've been exploring ever since. So the first thing that arose as a gap with decision makers is really trying to think through how to quantify both beneficial and detrimental effects of wildfire. Now, I started this call by talking about, wildfires burning Western forests for millennia. Forests are evolutionarily adapted to those fires, but we've also talked about how climate change and increasing fuel loads are intensifying our fire regimes. So how do we balance that and really measure where characteristics of fires even today are well in line with historical conditions and doing good work of reducing fuels, and where are they totally out of whack and threatening the resilience of our systems? We also heard a lot from decision makers that they really needed information about ecosystem resilience, but prior to when a fire burns. So how can we characterize the potential resilience of a system if a fire were to occur there? And decision makers really wanted this information because they felt like it could help them prioritize across those huge areas of the Western United States. The third knowledge gap that we heard is that there was really a need for quantifying the impact of management, so that prescribed burning and mechanical thinning that was already happening on the landscape. It's kind of an unprecedented time with investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of the amount of treatments that could be done. And so managers really wanted to understand what were the impacts of those treatments when they occurred. And then they felt like that information could be extremely valuable for making the case for continued investment and even expanded investment. The fourth knowledge gap we heard is that there was really a need from decision makers for better predictions and projections of how fire and ecosystems were likely to change over days to decades. This was both to support tactical decision making, so near-term allocation of resources, for example, within a fire season, as well as much longer-term strategic decision making about how policy could have cascading impacts over years to decades in the future. And then the final knowledge gap we heard is that decision makers really needed improved frameworks for scaling and extrapolating science from one place to another or from one scale to another. Just to highlight kind of what we mean by that, the GDPs, if you look at Oregon, Washington, and California, are roughly 2.5 times larger than the rest of Western states, the other Western states combined. And what that means is they have tremendous more resources for workforce development, for research. So how can we build on the momentum that's growing in those states, take lessons learned, and then apply them to less well-resourced states? Following up on these knowledge gaps, we came together and developed 5 objectives for WFFRC that are going to guide our research for the next several years. So the first is to build a community of practice and continue to nurture it, where we build relationships of trust with diverse stakeholder groups or decision makers so that we know what their research needs are and how they evolve during this time of rapid change. But also, so as our science comes online, we can quickly inject it into the decision-making process. We're spending a lot of time of really trying to understand the mechanisms that underpin resilience. So this directly ties to that knowledge gap that I highlighted previously of being able to make maps of forest resilience before fires occur. And that requires a mechanistic understanding of those underpinning drivers. We're doing a lot of work on remote sensing to improve our ability to track forests and fire from space at fine spatial resolutions and in as real time as possible. And then using that information to inform process-based simulation models to make those near-term predictions and longer-term projections. And finally, because people are so reliant on Western forests for ecosystem services, we're quantifying the consequences, how those are going to change. For example, air quality, carbon storage, water provisioning. And so those are going to be the three sections of this talk that I'm going to focus on and give you more specific examples of the types of products we're producing and the next steps that we're planning to explore in each of these chunks. So let's focus first on the tracking forest and fire bucket. And I'm going to talk about a project focused on trying to improve our ability to track ecologically beneficial wildfire. This was work led by Jennifer Balch at CU Boulder in a collaboration with one of her PhD students, Tyler McIntosh. Jennifer came to one of our early meetings where she heard decision makers talking about this need to better track ecologically beneficial wildfire. And I think it was an aha moment where she said, you know what? We have the data in hand to be able to do this. And so she really hit the ground running with Tyler to be able to produce this product quite quickly. What they did is they leveraged a new remote sensing algorithm that Sean Parks developed. He's with the Forest Service out of Missoula, that actually takes field-based estimates of burn severity. This is the composite burn index, and then links that with algorithms to remotely sensed burn severity indexes like RDNBR. And what that allows them to do is then map at 30-meter pixel resolutions across entire fire perimeters. Where were we seeing fire that was low severity versus high severity? And they did this for all forest fires that started, wildfires that started between 2010 and 2020. And then what they did is they took this Landfire historical fire regime product that brought together 600 experts to try to interrogate diverse data sets to determine what was the historical fire severity most like in diverse vegetation types across all of the Western United States. So this would have been pre-Euro-American settlement fire severity. And they compared the two. So just as an example, if a pixel burned at low severity between 2010 and 2020, and our historical fire severity product suggested that it should have burned at low severity, we would consider that ecologically beneficial wildfire that's likely reducing fuels, revitalizing ecosystems. In contrast, if a pixel burned between 2010 and 2020 is stand replacing high severity fire, but historically it should have burned at low severity, we would consider that detrimental fire. And then finally, in the contemporary period, if a pixel burned at high severity stand replacing fire, but our historical product said it should have burned at high severity stand replacing fire, we also considered that beneficial. So what did we find? Well, some really interesting insights came from this analysis. The first is if you look at this broad map of all the fire perimeters from 2010 to 2020 in the Western United States, you can see that there's really wide variation in the percent of those perimeters that was burned by ecologically beneficial fire. Purple being 100% good fire, orange being 0% good fire. But then if you zoom in on individual fire perimeters, like we're doing here for the August complex fire in California, you can see there's tremendous heterogeneity in ecologically beneficial versus detrimental fire, even within a single perimeter. The second really important point that I think is critical to highlight is that ecologically beneficial wildfire for this 2010 to 2020 period is making up more than half of all of the area burned by forest wildfires during that time period. So it's quite a lot of area, and it far surpassed the area that we were able to treat with prescribed burns. So this highlights how ecologically beneficial wildfire could be a really critical and valuable tool for helping us meet our management objectives. And we think analyses like this could help managers build social license for more wildfire use to reduce those fuels when it's ecologically appropriate and the risk is low. Now, this paper is in review, but there's a preprint that's posted on an archive. So if you're interested in taking a look, I suggest using the QR code to take you right to the paper. So we're continuing to build on this effort. This was a really quick first step and it's super useful, but we also know that there's probably many more dimensions to what constitutes ecologically beneficial fire than just if the severity is in line with what we would expect historically. So our Deputy Director, Crystal Raymond, who's at the University of Washington, along with myself and several other WFFRC folks, have been thinking about how to build and operationalize a more rich and nuanced framework. And we've come up with these 4 categories that we're building this framework around for determining ecologically beneficial fire. So the first category is thinking about pre-fire ecological condition. And this is variables like climate vulnerability before a fire even occurs, the history and legacy of past disturbance and management, and then regeneration potential. We have another bucket that constitutes active fire behavior that would include both fire intensity and speed. Then we're thinking about short-term post-fire effects. So that would be 1 to 2 years post-fire that includes that fire severity, as we've already looked at, but also thinks about fire return interval, right? So are we getting really rapid reburns that threaten the resilience of this system? And then finally, post-fire seed source potential. The last category is ecological outcomes over much longer time periods, out to 20 years. So are we creating over the long term landscape biodiversity and biodiversity? Are we actually having an impact in reducing catastrophic future fires or changing subsequent fire behavior and severity? And then what are the consequences for other ecosystem services? Now let's move into the projecting forest and fire section of this talk. And I'm going to highlight some of our work on process-based modeling to make long-term projections. This is actually a project that dates back before WFFRC. So this was a collaboration that's been ongoing for 7 or 8 years now between myself and Park Williams, who's now at UCLA. But it dates back to when I was a postdoc with Park at Columbia University. You know, we were out actually on a run talking science during one of the days that I was there and started to think about how we could make projections that really captured both the complexity of fire into the future, as well as its interactions with forests and the responses of forests. You know, these are dynamically coupled systems. We got back from that run and started poking around at what tools existed to make that kind of model projection and just didn't feel like the right tool was out there. So perhaps naively, we endeavored on building our own. It's called DynaForest, the Dynamic Temperate and Boreal Fire and Forest Ecosystem Simulator. And what it does is it pairs a statistical fire model that operates at a monthly temporal resolution, 12-kilometer spatial resolution, with a process-based forest model that really focuses on trying to represent the critical processes through which fires impact forests. This is what a diagram of the processes look like for each year. So we start here at the beginning of the year in simulation world. In any grid cell that had forest at some time in the past, but that forest was killed, we estimate the probability of tree regeneration as a function of seed production and dispersal from neighboring grid cells. We estimate the probability of germination establishment as a function of climate conditions. If probabilistically a forest cohort establishes in that grid cell, we then grow those trees and use that information to derive stand structure. Using turnover rates and decomposition processes, we can represent pools of snags, litter, and coarse wood. Then we take those live and dead fuel profiles, pass it on to the fire model where it's combined with many, many other variables of climate and human land use to estimate the occurrence of at least one fire in every grid cell, then their numbers and their maximum sizes. We grow realistic fire perimeter shapes for each of those fires, use information on forest characteristics and climate to estimate crown kill and combustion, and then finally estimate the probability of mortality in each of those grid cells. So this whole cycle plays out annually, and the fire model operates monthly. When we first started out, we felt like the forest piece, because it's a biological entity that we're trying to represent, was probably the highest risk. And so we really wanted to see if we could build that framework out first. And what we did is, so here on the left, you're looking at a simulation for the observed period, and we're looking at the stems per hectare of forests of the Western United States as simulated by DynaForest. And then we benchmarked the model with observations for 5 really large regions that are quite diverse in terms of their historical and contemporary fire regimes and their forest characteristics. You can see the different plant functional types that we represent in the model right here. So I won't go into too much detail about this benchmarking. We published a paper a few years ago, so feel free to scan the QR code there if you want to take a look at how well Dynaforest does on the forest side. But just as a really quick taste, we looked at modeled results in brown versus observations in purple, the observations being the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis plot network for live and dead biomass broken out by leaf, litter, stem and branch, and coarse wood. So that's just one example of the type of benchmarking that we did. After that, we've been investing several years in trying to build out the complexity of the fire model. And right now, we're just wrapping up the paper that describes it. Park is probably working on it as we speak right now. The fire model is actually built from 3 separate regression equations. So the first is a multivariate logistic regression to estimate the probability of at least one fire occurring in every grid cell month. If a fire is determined to occur, at least one fire is determined to occur, we then use logistic regression to estimate the number of fires in that grid cell month. And finally, we use multivariate linear regression to estimate sizes for each of those fires. So I'm going to walk you through some of the equations. Sorry, this is the only map that you're going to see on these slides, and hopefully I can explain it so that it's not super onerous. So this is the logistic regression equation that's used to estimate the probability of at least one fire occurring in every grid cell month. And now we're going to unpack what this term is actually composed of. So what we actually do is we break predictor variables into 3 separate components. Ones that vary most across space, so the broad geography of Western US forests. A separate component of predictor variables that vary most within a year but across seasons. And then a third component of predictor variables that vary most interannually, so from year to year. We estimate the impacts of each of these components separately using a forward model selection approach. So let's take the spatial predictors first. What we do is we look at all of the potential predictor variables and find the one that best explains the occurrence of fire in grid cells across Western US forests. We then save the residuals from that and rinse and repeat, where we then say, what is the next best predictor variable that explains that remaining variability? Save those residuals and move on until we've exhausted and found all of the predictor variables that significantly explain variation. We then do the same for seasonal predictors and interannual predictors and sum up those residuals to become the seasonal, the spatial, seasonal, and temporal components in the model. Once we have an estimated probability of fire, we compare it to a digital coin flip to see whether at least one fire occurs or not. And then we estimate the numbers of fires between 1 and 4, where the only predictor variable is that estimate of fire probability. So 4 was chosen because that is the most fires that have ever occurred in a 12-kilometer grid cell month during the observed period. And finally, we estimate fire sizes for each of those fires using an equation that's very similar to what we use to estimate probability of at least one fire occurring, having separate components for space, season, and time. But here we're predicting a standardized fire size anomaly, which then we back calculate from those anomalies to fire sizes using a generalized Pareto distribution. Okay, we're through the math. Let's look at some good figures here. So on the left here, we're actually looking at the annual fire probability across the Western United States. And you can see that it captures wide variation across the spatial domain. On the right here, we're looking at the annual area burned in 1,000 ensemble member set of simulations forced with observed climate. The black is the median of that from 1951 to today. And then the brown is our observations of how much area actually burned in the observed record. So you can see very strong correspondence at the west-wide scale. We've also used the same model to look at 4 regions separately. So this is, not 4 separate models, but applying the same model and seeing how skilled it is in different regions. And you can see model skill, as represented by the R-squared, does vary across these regions, but it's uniformly quite high. And we also are doing pretty well at capturing extreme events like the 1988 fires in Yellowstone. Right now, we're finishing up some cross-validation where we leave out years and grid cells, both temporally and spatially, to make sure the model is not overfit. And we're finding very little loss of predictive power when we leave data out, which is quite a good sign. I don't have results for that to show today, but it's ongoing. So what can we actually use this model for? Well, one of the things that we're really excited about in the near term is to actually try to quantify what is the relative contribution of human-caused climate change to the observed increases in burned area that we're seeing. So what we can do is run the simulation like we're doing in black there, where it's actually forced with observed climate that has the human climate change signal. And then we can run the model again, where we use a climate product where we've actually taken out the human-caused climate change signal and just left in natural climate variability. We call this the CMIP6 detrended climate data set. And that difference between the black and blue line is the amount of area burned in Western US forests that's attributable to human-caused climate change. We can also do really similar attribution studies to understand, emerging fuel feedbacks or the effects of past suppression on current patterns. The other really exciting thing that I'm just so excited to jump into is because it's a spatially explicit model, we can actually look across space at how the impacts of climate change have affected fire probability. So that's what we're looking at here, is what is the impact of human-caused climate change on the potential for larger forest fires over the past decade. And you can see there is really distinct spatial variability. So the Sierras of the California light up a lot, the southwest portions light up, but places like the Northern Rockies, Greater Yellowstone, for example, we don't see quite as much of an impact. Our next steps for this work are to start doing a huge ensemble model simulation experiment to make future projections of fire and forest ecosystem change through 2100. So we've just statistically downscaled 26 different GCMs and 3 SSPs, a low-end emission scenario, a middle of the road, and a high-end emission scenario. And we'll be running ensemble simulations across that GCM and SSP combination to try to constrain what kind of future fire activity we might expect to see. I have a figure here that shows some preliminary results of that. So this is 26 GCMs forced with just the middle of the road emission scenario. And you can see by 2050, we're getting massive increases in burned area, even when we simulate forest dynamically and would allow for fuel limitations to build up. For reference, our current observed record year of 2020 is right here, and it becomes roughly the annual average by the mid to the end of this 21st century. One of the other things that I'm really excited about for this kind of work is we could compare to these climate baselines by running counterfactual scenarios of different management strategies and see how those management strategies bend the curve or decouple climate from fire compared to these baselines. Let's go into the final section here of this talk and highlighting some research on consequences for ecosystem services. So one of the ecosystem services I've been most interested in my lab group for several years now is carbon storage from a climate mitigation and natural climate solutions perspective. And if you're going to really understand carbon storage potential and risk, you need to set very rigorous baselines of what is our carbon storage today to then compare future change to. So a few years ago, a research associate in my group, Jaslyn Hall, started leading an effort in collaboration with another research associate in my group, Minette Sander, to try to set those baselines. And they asked 3 questions. So the first is, what is the spatial distribution of forest carbon in Western US forests today? And then second, what is the climate disturbance, human and topographic drivers that underpin that distribution? And how has it changed between 2005 and today? To do these analyses, we leveraged the Forest Inventory and Analysis Plot Network that the Forest Service uses. that produces. If you're not familiar with this, it's an extraordinary resource. So it's 160,000 plots across the United States that's sampled every 5 to 10 years by the Forest Service to keep their finger on the pulse of forest health. And here's some results of what we found. So first we looked for across 18 forested ecoregions and just asked how is forest carbon in live and dead pools distributed across these ecoregions. Now, we're not going to get the Nobel Prize for these results. This is information we've known for a long time, but it suggested that our analysis approach is on the right track. So of course, in the productive forests of the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot more carbon. In forests of the Southwest, there's a lot less carbon. But then the results get really interesting when we start to look at, well, what are the climate, human, and fire drivers that shape those patterns? And Jazz is a whiz with machine learning, particularly interpretable machine learning that helps us understand the underpinning drivers of the predictions that are made. So she used SHAP values, which provides an understanding at the grid cell level of the relative importance of predictor variables to determine what was driving patterns of live and dead carbon across this diverse region. And there's some fascinating patterns that emerged. I've sat here and looked at these maps for many hours over the last several years. So the first thing that pops out if we look at the drivers of live carbon is there's really distinct regional patterns, right? So the Pacific Northwest is dominated by human drivers. This makes a lot of sense because forests in the Pacific Northwest were harvested, for timber for decades to centuries. So it really has a strong fingerprint there. In contrast, places like the Northern Rockies, fire is the dominant driver of patterns of carbon. And then in the Southwest, we see climate variables being really important. This is also not surprising because large areas of the Southwestern region have just emerged from the biggest mega drought in 1,200 years. And it was those drought variables that were really important. But what's super cool, because you can plot variable importance at the grid cell level, is you can see the fine scale spatial heterogeneity as well, right? So we can see at the 4-kilometer grid cell resolution that there is very large diversity of the drivers that are important, which I think is really critical information for managers. We also quantified trends at the ecoregion level over time, and these also align with expectations, but perhaps are a little concerning. So in the Pacific Northwest, we see actual pretty large increases in forest carbon storage from 2005 to 2019. And this is also not surprising because this region is emerging from a long period of timber extraction, and many forests are recovering from that. In contrast, we're starting to see declines in live forest carbon storage in the Northern Rockies, where fire was a really big deal, and the Southwest, where drought was a really big deal. And that corresponds with increases in dead carbon in those regions that will eventually be combusted by fires or decomposed and returned to the atmosphere. Now, this analysis was, solid and really cool. But there are some key limitations that we're trying to build on. So the first thing is because the Forest Inventory and Analysis Plot Network doesn't share true plot locations to protect the privacy of landowners, you never quite know at a very fine spatial resolution where that forest plot actually was. They're often, fuzzed and swapped about a half mile from the true plot location. And so to conduct that analysis, we had to aggregate to the 4-kilometer grid cell level, which is pretty coarse. The other real challenge with this forest inventory and analysis approach is they only sample plots, roughly every 10 years in the Western United States. And if we want annual updates during this time of really rapid, abrupt change, that's going to be tough. So Jazz has been endeavoring since then to develop new approaches to leverage remote sensing to get at this estimate of forest carbon in a way that can be much more real time and at the 30-meter resolution of Landsat. And what she's doing is she's using spectral unmixing analysis with Landsat to actually further break those carbon pools into live, dead, and declining components. She's been collaborating with a Forest Service scientist, Andy Hudak, to develop out this workflow. And so what they do is they take field inventories where we know the true plot locations, And then they build algorithms to link that with LiDAR. So one of the challenges with LiDAR in the past has been it's really expensive to fly large areas, but we're slowly accumulating quite a catalog that covers a lot of forests in the West. And so they're building LiDAR-derived tree above ground biomass estimates, and then taking that as truth to train Landsat algorithms that allow us to do forest carbon from 1985 all the way to the present. And finally, using that spectral mixing analysis to break it into pools like live and dead. So this research is ongoing, but we hope to have products available here in the next year or so. The next ecosystem service section that I'm super excited about is emissions and smoke. I think smoke is one of the things that impacts the most people most directly from fires, even in urban centers, and it's an area that's been understudied a bit. So this is research that's led by Miriam Marlier and Claire Scholard at the University of California, Los Angeles. And they're asking questions like what emissions were produced from past Western US forest fires and how much will be produced into the future. They're asking questions about where does that smoke go? And then they're asking questions about who's affected by that smoke. Again, this research has just started in the last year, but we're already seeing really exciting and interesting results. So the first thing they did is they took Dynaforest simulations of fire and forest, the model that I talked about earlier, and they used emissions factors to estimate from those fires what were the PM 2.5 emissions in teragrams. And then they compared that to other existing data sets or products of emissions that are largely satellite driven. So when Claire first showed me this figure, I was just delighted, right? Because the Dynaforest estimates fall right in the middle of the spaghetti of other products estimates. But what's really unique about this approach is that the other products are all satellite derived and they can't extend them past the early 2000s. But in contrast, we can run Dynaforest well into the past. So here we're looking at simulations from 1951 up to today, but in theory, we could go even longer and longer into the past and develop hindcasts of smoke to understand how much smoke was produced from past fires, and especially pre-Euro-American settlement, where it's expected there was a lot more fire on the landscape. What would be the smoke load from that? The next steps from them are to use the ensemble of future Dynaforest simulations to figure out how much smoke we might be exposed to into the future, and then use an atmospheric transport model to figure out where that smoke might go. So here's an example from some of their other research where they estimated where smoke went from 2022 California fires. And finally, they're using epidemiological approaches to try to understand who might be most impacted by that smoke. So those are just a couple examples of the types of research that we're doing and the products we're producing both now and in the near future. I just wanted to close out by reiterating some of our goals. So if you leave the talk with one thing, leave with these. We're working to really try to understand how we can accelerate advancements to ensure decision makers are well supported in the Western United States. And we're doing that by conducting rapid and convergent actionable research in partnership with the decision makers who may use it. We're also really trying to catalyze innovation amongst the fire science community through open science best practices, through convening, through engagement. The co-PIs on this project are all frighteningly brilliant, extremely kind and friendly, and very responsive. It's a wonderful group to work with, distributed across the United States. Just wanted to give a brief shout out to Crystal Raymond, our Deputy Director, who started last July and has really professionalized our engagement with decision makers. We've built such momentum because of her expertise and contributions. And each of those co-PIs are hiring and working with incredible students and postdocs and research personnel. All of them are really fun to work with. So this is us at our annual retreat last fall at Sedgwick Preserve, just outside Santa Barbara. And finally, I'd like to give a shout out and large thanks to our program manager, Nicole Gange, and project coordinator, Kate Amato, who keep the wheels on the bus make sure that we can keep building momentum in the science because they've got the administration under control. I'm so appreciative to each of them. I think Kate is on the call today, so thanks, Kate. And with that, happy to take any questions you have. If you want to check out the website, feel free to scan the QR code. And we are continuing to hire postdocs and data scientists. So if you're interested, please do reach out. I'd love to chat with you. So I'll stop sharing and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Winslow. This was amazing. We do have one question from Justin asking about your familiarity with the Big Map data project.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Big Map Data Project product is definitely on our radar, and it's something that we've been working with. For those of you who aren't familiar, Big Map is a Forest Service-led effort to take forest inventory and analysis plots and to use gradient nearest neighbors to try to make wall-to-wall maps of many characteristics in the FIA data. And we definitely are, really excited to leverage that product. We've had some conversations with folks with them and see it as really essential.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thanks, Winslow. Just wanted to make sure you were aware. It sounded like it was kind of similar, but obviously some differences with, using the LiDAR data. So that's exciting to get the LiDAR in there. And I know that's, a direction the Big Map team has talked about. So awesome. Looking forward to seeing that roll out. So,
yeah,
cheers.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Justin. Any other questions out there?
Josh?
Hey, Winslow. Yeah, I got a question for you. What opportunities or roadblocks are there with utilizing all the prescribed fires that we're putting out right now for this type of research, whether it's, data on the intensity of the burn or because obviously those are going to be the best and safest ways to get a lot of this data and validate that data. What opportunities do you see, and is that getting better, or would you like to see it, more opportunities?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I totally agree that that's a critical opportunity because you have the opportunity to collect that pre-fire data, right? And then get the post-fire snapshot. So we're directly not working on that within WFFRC, but there's many organizations and groups that are. So one of the exciting ones that I think has a lot of potential is NASA's Fire Sense program, where they're flying planes with fancy sensors across prescribed burns and really trying to understand emissions from those fires and post-fire impacts. I also think that it's one of our best opportunities to better constrain combustion and emissions from fires. So, I mentioned these emissions factors that we use to calculate PM 2.5, but it's really often hard to find data on how much was actually combusted from those fires. And so my hope is that we'll continue to and expand efforts to leverage prescribed burns to estimate those emissions factors. And then the final thing is, I think we got to do more research on how prescribed fire impacts scale, right? So we know that when a fire hits a treatment, it has really strong impacts. But how does that scale to the landscape? How does that scale to the whole Western United States? What is the minimum area that we need to strategically treat so that we can get those cascading larger scale effects? Justin has his hand up if you want to ask your question, Justin.
Yeah. Sorry, Winslow. So kind of teeing up off of kind of leveraging some newer technologies coming online. Are you pulling in any tempo data too? Is that also kind of on folks' radars to kind of, see what sort of emissions factors or column, as far as it relates to NOx, PM within the column and potentially formaldehyde? Is that going to be folded into any of the atmospheric side?
So I actually have never heard of tempo before. So I'd love if you could tell me a little bit about what it is.
Sure. Tempo is a geostationary, so you get an hourly scan across CONUS. It just launched last year. The NO2 column data product, I think, is available going back through last year. And then they're starting to roll out the validated PM product or AOD product rather. So I'd happy to shoot you an email on it and connect you to the science lead at NASA. So,
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Justin. Really appreciate it.
no problem.
No questions, just a note of appreciation. This is a great
Right.
seminar and very informative. Thanks, Winslow.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for your attention and taking the time out of your day. If things pop up that you want to chat about, don't hesitate to reach out, and hope to see you all in the future. Thanks, Ilke and Claire, for organizing this. It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Winslow. Great presentation, and appreciate everyone's time today. And we look forward to the next opportunity that we can all connect. And with that, we'll